dear guests and audience. It is an honor to meet you here. I welcome you all to our digital conference, 1 Terawatt Solar in Europe. Is it possible? I'm the host today, Cheryl Yu, research analyst from Leader Associates. Well, let me first give you a brief overview of how we interact in our meeting rooms. You can find the chat box and the Q&A function below. If you have any questions, you can communicate through the chat box and our colleague will confirm it in real time. And if you want to ask questions to our guests, you can use the Q&A function. Our event is organized in conjunction with Solar Energy Future Europe 2022. This is the European PV exhibition conference dedicated to solar storage and advanced management of future assets, where you can expand your network, get a complete overview of the future of solar, and join the dynamic interactive events. We look forward to welcoming you offline to go deeper into the solar market and promote the development of solar in Europe together. Well, first, it's our agenda today. After a turbulent quarter of 2022 in the energy market, various countries have begun to take action. They seem to all have very high expectations of solar energy. So today's event is divided into content and opinion sharing for specific topics and a panel discussion. Topics covered include the theoretical outlook, policy and framework support, and the possibilities, challenges, and solutions of the development of solar. Let's find out if the EU could see an explosion of solar PV in the next 10 decades. The next session will be brought by Dr. Vlasios Oikonomou, setting the appropriate framework with the EU's plan forward. Let's welcome him.
Thank you very much for the invitation. So I'm going to share now my presentation. Indeed, I will be speaking more from the level of the policy angle now and how the policies in the EU, starting from the EU as a focus, are actually shaping up the entire landscape on what we achieve, what we have achieved, what not, and where we still miss, and also create opportunities. I hope you can see my presentation and we can start. As I said, the main parts we'll be dealing in now is from the RES targets and the state of play up to 2020 from the evaluation carried out, and the future target and some good practices and how all these things mix up. Because what we have to realize is that the policy landscape from the renewable energy supply schemes is not fragmented, meaning that the RES legislation is also intertwined with legislation on energy efficiency and climate one. So we do have a lot of overlaps and complementarities where we must actually invest on it more and see how these things can all bridge together and come up to more sustainable investments in the end of the day and avoiding conflicts of investments. Now, this is the status of the play of where we stand so far in the countries, whether you can see that the member states, if they have achieved their targets or not. In the majority, we are quite high in terms of what has happened in the first period of 2020. And most of the countries are already I would say they have achieved the targets. Of course, we have to consider it, if you take the EU marked in red, we are almost there. But we have to keep in mind that it's not only because of the efforts of the investments, but also rather because of the COVID and the slowdown of industry activity and travel that we have to achieve the targets, because the targets are set on the final energy consumption. Okay, this is something we always must keep in mind when speaking about renewable energy targeting. And it has to do that if the whole consumption drops, then somehow with the existing capacity, we can reach out the target. So it is, of course, a sign that we are on a good track, but it's not a reassuring sign that we don't need to do more. Okay, I would say it in this way. Also, if you take the BAU scenarios, we might have already missed quite some parts of the targets. Okay, now this is more or less the image of the picture of what stands in the entire EU. The countries marked in the blue and these purple ones are the ones who are still, I wouldn't say laggards, but we still need to do more to capture the final energy saving, the final energy from RES. Now, in terms of the generating part, if we take from the assessment from 2020, we see that the renewable energy supply in general have made up 37% of gross electricity consumption in the EU. The good thing is that we have a rise by 3% since 2019, and there you can see also the split between the various parts. For the solar part that we're interested here, we are on the 14% in total of the RES supply, and this part is the one that will increase more together with the wind over the coming years. So there is a lot of big part and the gap actually to be covered by the solar industry in the coming period. When it comes now to the electricity part, here I've got quite a diverse picture in terms of the countries and the member states. The graph shows the electricity from RES as a percentage of the total gross consumption in 2020. And in average in the EU, it's about 37.5%. Some countries have been quite front runners in it as a total RES. For instance, in Norway and Iceland, we're seeing more electricity from RES than consumed, including hydro, of course. And more than 70% of electricity was generated from RES in Austria and Sweden. So you can see on the right, on the left side, these are the countries that have actually covered much more higher on the target or for the final energy consumption than the others. And the weird thing is that a lot of the other countries are countries that do have a lot of capacity also on the solar part, given their geographical position, I would say. This means that these countries can do and will need to do more to cover and bridge the gaps. Now, in terms of growth per source, this is from, this actually shows the capacity growth, which is indeed driven by wind and solar, coming back to what Pietro said before, and this nice images that were presented. This kind of shows over the years from 2010 to 2020, how the whole rest, the green line, has increased. And the contribution of solar and of course wind is quite important, while this is also complementing and adding up to the loss we're going to have from the fossil fuel in the coming period. Hopefully, of course, we expect that the trends will go on as they used to be, and there will be a major shift towards the rest, and we will not have a curve, you know, reversing again on the fossil industry, which I think that the solution so far in the investment and the autonomous trend seems to be that, and this will remain like that. Now, in terms of the transport also, which is an interesting part for us, there we also have that we have the target of the 10% from the Commission for the share of renewable energy used in transport by 2020. And there is really that very few countries have managed to achieve it, I would say, in the real sense. Only Sweden, of course, with 32%, but overall in the EU, it's about 10.2%. The work has been achieved by 2020. Here is the tricky part is more investments will need to take place because the transport, you know, is not, Greece, of course, is a laggard here with 5.3%. The thing is that with especially with the transport, it's not so much only on the investments that will take place from the RES supply, but it's also with the fragmentation and the types of market we have from the suppliers of energy for the transport sector and the fleets. Because there we have quite different diverse markets in the EU. Some are quite tending to be oligopolistic markets. Other ones are more open with more suppliers. Other ones are more monopolistic. So here, this is quite so much reflected on the types of markets that the legislation will be imposed and the targets will be imposed on. That's why we cannot have a real clear sign on what would mean that for transport. Now, on the heating and cooling, which is also the big debate on how the rest will be practically the front runner, and that they have to be the front runner, and solar will be a very important source here. What we see is that up to 2020, we had up to 23.1% of the total energy used for heating and cooling in the EU coming from the renewable energy supply. And the important is that the trend is increasing as we had, I mean, if we take, let's say 15 years back, 2004, it was almost 12% lower. And this means that RES are playing a role and are gradually playing a role. And next, of course, Sweden and some other countries which have the highest percentage for heating and cooling. Also, it has to do with the market on how the district heating and the district cooling market grids are operative, and if you have heat lows or cooling lows in the countries. Still, the trend here seems to be increasing. And also this will be for sure reflected with the higher gas prices coming up everywhere in Europe, and also the new eco-design directive that will come up to some point where with the banning of the new fossil fuel boilers and the gradual replacement of the fossil fuel boilers with heat pumps and also other forms of and other technologies. So I would say that here, not only about solar heating, but also the role of the PVs for net metering, for instance, for heat pumps, could be enormous to cover this gap. And this is something that we need to really think on clearly and how to invest more, as this will be practically the one. Coming from an energy efficiency perspective, I would say that this will be practically the one that would play the major role for the solar industry, next, of course, to the large parts of the large investments. So here is a big gap. And this is something we need to take into account, the role of bridging energy efficiency, changing fossil fuel boilers to heat pumps, and then how the solar PVs can play the role there. Now, for the electricity, of course, in the spotlight coming back, indeed, you know it more than anybody else that in 2008, it was a very small share, and we have the solar industry has grown by 14% for how much it is recovering, in the rest in the EU. And it's the fastest growing energy source. And linked to wind and hydro, of course, we can have the results we need. In terms of the policies now that are being put in the market, I think it was really nice mentioned before on the divergence of policies we have. And the interesting thing, if you take into account the EU member states, that we do have a lot of RES policies in force for which cover all the renewable energy supply schemes, but few targeted only on PVs. And solar. So the green line shows the number of policy instruments we have operation in various countries. It can be regional, local, but also national, of course, and with various funding streams coming from RRFs and the existing renewable, and also existing ERDFs and other funds. So the green bars show the numbers of RES policies in force, and the blue ones are the ones with a more specific target for solar. So they, of course, it's important that we do have targeted policies. And in some countries, of course, the numbers are higher, but we have to, if we compare it to the size of the supply that is being generated, we see that policies do tend to work more over the years. This is actually kind of, again, of a snapshot of what happens in the EU in terms of the various policies in place. Again, if you take all the financial schemes, indeed, the abundance, most countries do use them, and we show some nice examples before. And we do have also the other thing on the information advice and prescriptive regulation codes and standards also being applied to other countries. Mainly when you speak about codes and standards, the easiest thing that comes in the mind is for several countries that they use solar water heating, for instance, as a mandatory code for new buildings. Just a very easy one to say. Of course, there are even more, and they have to do also with the location and the placement of the various PVs and showed before. Now, what happens, what's up actually now in the market, because this will be the one driving, in essence, the investments up forward. If we've seen up to 2020, had a target of the 20%, which is growing now up to the 32% so far, based on the Renewable Energy Directive, with a target of 2030. And it means that here we need to cover a larger gap of investments, while the Green Deal, the famous Green Deal, has, with the decarbonization target, has already driven up this number much more. But an important element here is that although the 32% was a target so far being followed, we do have the Fit for 55 package coming up some months ago, and the plans in top of that. And you know that the Commission is planning from the 32 up to 40% by 2030 in a more ambitious track. And this would mean about 30 gigawatt per year extra capacity. And for solar, I think the numbers show that it would be around 420 gigawatts up to 2030 just for the solar part. And while the Parliament recently, I think the 14th, 15th of March, they aimed for a higher target, and this is going to be evaluated from 32 to go up to 45% RES. Up to 2030, and this will be reevaluated to see how achievable it would be. But in any case, even if we stick to the 40% being the solution for solar industry, this would mean a 420 gigawatts extra capacity up to 2030 in the 8 years to come. Now, tripling, let's say, these targets for both wind and solar, if we take into account that this is the historic trajectory of what was happening up to 2000 so far. I mean, this is the dark line. This is what the plans were from the national energy and climate plans from all the member states, with a high ambitious, in some cases, let's say, supply that they were estimating. This is the orange line. But in order to achieve all the targets, all the scenarios show that we need to go to a much higher now capacity, so tripling almost the quantities generating. If we take into account that the funds that will be received are adequate for that, and the targets and the instruments are correct and smartly set, this would mean really a massive boost of the solar world and the solar PVs in the coming years, in the coming 8 years up to 2030. Now, also we must not forget the headline target of the 40%. And the sub-targets here is that 49% of the energy used in buildings to come from RES. So here mainly the solar will be the important part. Again, as I said, on the industry will be 1.1% annually increase of the renewable energy supply use. And we might have the 1.1% annual increase in the use of RES in heating and cooling. So solar heating and solar cooling could be an important part, and this would become binding. So it's not anymore an aggregate target for all, but it's a binding 1.1% target. 2.1% increase in the target for district heating and cooling. Again, this is an important part for the solar part. Intensity of transport fuels, and then biofuels in transport, and all the rest is more generic for the rest part. But for the first ones, heating and cooling and district heating and cooling, the solar industry should play a role to capture, also to cover the gap for the binding targets that will be set. Also, we've got the REPowerEU, the plan that was submitted and was presented some weeks ago due to the war. And here I've got that there is a deployment of 480 gigawatts of wind capacity, for, as we said, and this it's a front-loading investments and would save the known amounts of gas. So you see that the various legislative pieces support this part. And we have now lots of good practices, of course, in terms of policies, and I will just go briefly to show some ideas on how we merge RES with efficiency, apart from projects we have been doing. And we've seen, like in, we have several, for instance, in Italy, the Dolomites, there is 29 municipalities that will redevelop 60 buildings and lighting points. And the 7% will be achieved through building envelopes, energy efficiency parts, 35 eco-compatible, and 8% from 9 solar thermal systems, district heating, water heat pumps, and 24 photovoltaic systems. That's a nice merge of how energy efficiency can bridge with solar investments and actually cover both targets of energy efficiency and RES. And this is what we have to keep in mind, that this will be an easier accepted solution, less arguments from the public, and can boost more investments and multiplying effects. Likewise in Cyprus, the presentation will be public, so you can have a look from the voluntary even carbon markets and how this works with the solar PV's investments. And there is also the cooperatives, which will play a role, and they tend to play a role more and more in several parts. You can have an example here from Croatia, which was a solar PV system installed of development centers and technology parks, and how they have merged actually with efficiency parts. Now, I would say 2 more things and stop here, is that, as I said, we have also the EED, the Energy Efficiency Directive, which is with the specific articles it sets the lines and ring fences energy efficiency towards RES. But we have good examples where obligations for energy efficiency towards suppliers can invest in measures for improvement in energy efficiency in end-use sectors, including small-scale RES and cogeneration. So RES can be part also of the efficiency package, okay? And this is where they actually can enter into the whole renovation investments, buildings renovation investments. This we must not forget, especially for the small scale, for the PVs. And RES for both heat and electricity for self-supply are treated as energy efficiency measures. So this is a part that we have to take into account. And the last one is that we have the energy efficiency first principle, which actually balances investments between supply and demand. It's a quite difficult principle to be followed, although it has passed in the new legislation in the Article 3 of the ED. And what it says that in essence, we must always leverage between the investments on the demand and the supply side, hierarchy, the investments based on the social cost benefit analysis. And here we have good examples, and I would say really use that and have a look on how, in essence, investing in supply side and investing if minimum energy performance of the building envelope is met first with the right sizing and positive impacts, can also contradict with incentives based on the expected heat demands or amount of heat produced. So this is an important one, and it can play bridging the heat pump worlds together with the solar worlds, and how this thing can be prioritized as investment under the energy efficiency rules and the energy efficiency first principle. And why integrated approaches are essential? Because the lower the demand, the easier to cover with 100% RES. This we can fully understand, and this reflects the targets as we explained before. So energy efficiency and demand response are essential alternatives to the electricity infrastructure needed for the 100% RES. Then the higher RES requires, and the higher solar, let's say, would require demand-side flexibility, coming back to efficiency and the role of efficiency on flexibility with demand response. Avoiding lock-in effects at building level, so solar on buildings might impede further improvements of the building fabric, and checking that the building is net zero ready. That's also an important element. And then important, of course, the last one is the local energy communities, which can play a major role in the whole part of the energy use, but also promoting, of course, the RES flows. And here are some good examples of the energy communities, which you all know, I guess, and some of you are also participating on, and how the energy communities can play a role and can invest in the solar parks and capture also social effects such as reducing energy poverty. So multiple, their solar, I mean, in a nutshell, I would say that the solar investments and investments in the solar energy can help out in reaching out both efficiency, but also social aspects such as the energy poverty and all the various legislative acts required to cover and reduce energy poverty in the EU. Thank you very much. I hope it was an overall picture, and yeah, questions.
Well, thanks, Vlasios. Very complete. I have a question for you, is that you have mentioned the approaches taken by different countries are quite, well, different. So is there any incentives or policies you think are the most effective one? Can you introduce one or two for us?
Some actually were mentioned by the previous speaker, by Pietro, on the tax incentives and the auction schemes and the various feed-in tariffs we provided. So in terms of countries, we do have the French, for instance, incentives, also the Dutch ones. But if you have a look at the various policies, I would say a lot of them do resemble. The thing is that in terms of cost effectiveness, a lot of them are on already increasing their cost effectiveness level over the course of the years, and also the adjustments taking place. So there are several similarities. I think the most important part, if you could say in a nutshell, would be the ones that have a better targeting, are more realistic in terms of the projects that they want to attract. So not being too generic and getting everybody on board, because the evaluation procedures are enormous afterwards, and it's important to have, for the evaluator perspective, to be able to compare both relevant projects and similar projects on what goes first and putting the hierarchy that. So not only price, but also the quantities and the qualities we need. And I would say that the smart policies in the future will be the ones that can integrate also all the other aspects that I mentioned. So also energy poverty aspects, efficiency aspects, and so forth.
Okay, thank you for sharing. And then let's move to our practical part and our panel discussion, regional positioning. We're to go in the progressive market environment. And our guests are Mr. Federico Giannandrea, Mr. Alfred Weinberger, and Ms. Melissa Stark. Let's welcome them. Well, first of all, I would like, please turn on your camera and voice. I would like to ask to introduce yourself and tell us which segment of solar industry chain you work in and what your focus is. Let's start with Federico.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Cheryl, and thank you very much to Leader Associates for inviting me. I'm Federico Giannandrea. I'm the head of Continental Europe Foresight Group. Foresight is an asset manager that has been in the market since 1984. We specialize, among others, in solar. We're probably currently the second largest solar operator in Europe with 1.7 gigawatts of installed capacity. And I'm in charge of, let's say, leading our investments and divestments in continental Europe, which includes Italy, Spain, Portugal, France, Germany, Greece, and so on.
Is it Alfred?
Good morning to everybody. Alfred Weinberger. I've been working in the power generation and power distribution business for more than 35 years. And I'm, since 2019, I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Amarenco Solar Austria. Amarenco is a leading international photovoltaic energy producer in Europe, the MENA region, and Asia Pacific. we here at Austria develop a 500 megawatt plus portfolio of utility-sized projects in Austria, in our neighboring countries, in the Central Europe, which is Czech, Slovak, Hungarian Republic, Slovenia, Croatia, Serbia, and we prepare this portfolio for investment by the group.
Okay, so Melissa, please.
Hi, everybody. Melissa Stark. I look after renewables and energy transition for Accenture globally. I've been working in the renewables and clean energy space since 2007, and our team probably focuses on three main things with respect to solar. One is the use of digital in the development part of for solar, particularly the really big projects where you've got millions of moving parts. And then on the operations and maintenance side, also in looking at digital to improve that. And then more recently in the commercial optimization on the revenue side, given everything that's been happening over the last couple of years.
Okay, thank you and welcome all. Well, Melissa, Accenture has a lot of research and input in the area of energy transition. So how do you see the current ambitious plan in the EU and the UK?
So I think the current plans, and they were covered really well by the previous two presenters, is looking at specifically for solar at like almost a tripling, right? For both Europe and the UK. So from Europe from about 165, 170 gigawatts to over 420, we heard. And then in the UK from 14 gigawatts to over 50 gigawatts. Now, a tripling is not really that unheard of. And if you're looking at our 2030 targets, that would be something like a 15 to 20% growth year on year. And we've already heard that there was, a 30% growth. And if you look at Japan over the last 9 years, that was about a 30% year on year growth rate. So I think it is definitely within the realm of what can be built. And I think then in the medium term, that definitely does help in terms of the security and resiliency issues that we're facing, and obviously with the volatility with much more solar demand and supply, then that's going to help some of the issues that we're seeing. However, those are medium term solutions, right? So I think in the short term, I loved the previous presenter talking about looking at supply and demand, because in the short term there are quite a few things that we can do to manage or to look at our current, challenges that we have. One, I think demand optimization and energy efficiency is something at least even we can do even now, even if it is only 10% or 15%. I think there is flexibility that we have existing, and there is energy efficiency that we have existing. We can try to store instead of curtail. And a lot of market policies that is around how you're dealing with your ancillary services products and how you're paying for those products. We do have the capacity to store instead of curtail, like some flexibility in many of the grid operations, and we can encourage self-consumption, because self-consumption definitely lets folks kind of opt out on that. So I think even within what we've got a lot of short-term things that we can do to help our situation, and we are seeing more and more of that come on. But certainly, yeah, we have to look at that growth to help with the medium and the long term. And I think, like the previous presenter said, no matter what forecast we've put, the solar market has beat that forecast.
So speaking of the short-term things, well, as the EU countries have to solve their energy problems in time, I have seen that many governments are currently considering restarting their coal or nuclear power. How do you see this kind of actions in the short term?
I think in the short term, we have to do what we have to do, right? I mean, in the short term, the challenge is to, reduce the dependence on Russian gas. That's the challenge. And I think it's not that we're using more fossil. Like if you just consider fossil and non-fossil, it's not that we're using more fossil, right? We might be replacing a Russian gas with coal. So we're still using fossil for fossil. And then if we're replacing it with nuclear, then it actually is zero carbon versus fossil. So I think I wouldn't get so caught up on what has to be done in the short term to deal with the situations that we have. because I think the key thing is that it doesn't happen again and that we build much more resilient systems. The more important thing are the policies that we heard that are being put in place to allow solar to grow and other renewables to grow and to be a bigger share of the market. I think we recognize that anyway, our electricity systems need to be different if they're going to be the backbone of a future energy system. I think we all know that. And I think we have seen many system operators look at, I would say, 6 main levers of transforming their electricity systems. We're seeing system operations done in a totally different way. We're seeing lots of new ancillary services products. We're seeing load and demand optimization. We're seeing much more interconnections. We're seeing much better hybridization and load follow of both hydropower and natural gas and even biomass. And we're, of course, we're looking at storage, right? And so without exception, in all of the markets where variable penetration is growing, we're seeing like different operators work with those different levers. So I think we are on the road to transforming our system to enable to take more solar. And that's really the most important thing that we need to see. And then we have short-term measures that we have to deal with, but as long as the policies are put in place to get that medium term right, then I think that's the way we have to go.
Yeah. And the Eastern Europe countries you mentioned, like Ukraine, Poland, and Bulgaria, they were actually very hot markets for PV. And do you think whether the current shocks will have an impact on future investments in these markets?
I think what we've seen from Europe is a doubling down on renewables. I think, we saw that with COVID. I mean, I think everybody was like, what's going to happen with renewables in COVID? And it just grew, got stronger. The grids we had so many record penetrations. It just came, wind and solar showed up stronger than I think anyone even expected. And I think we're seeing that again now. I think we're seeing governments double down on renewables. And actually what I'm seeing is just an acceleration of the trends that were already there. I think we knew that we had to deal with demand and supply equally. I think we knew that, and now we totally have to do it because a lot of our short-term stuff is that. I think we knew we had to deal with flexibility. We talked about renewables and flexibility and reliability a lot. Now we have to deal with resiliency too, which is great. We always had that system upgrade issue. We heard about those interconnection queues. Those are not surprises to anyone here on the and the new permitting laws are fantastic. And I think folks have been waiting for that as well. So I think there were all these things that we knew we kind of had to do, and we had to accelerate the market reform. And now with what's happening, it's just making it move faster.
Okay, I think you mentioned many things that we have to do or we must to do, but what do you think are the biggest bottlenecks that these companies might encounter, or are there any innovative ways to address these issues?
Well, I guess maybe it should come over that what we are doing, not what we should have to do, because like I'm on the Technology Advisory Council for National Grid ESO in the UK. And in the UK, we have a target of no limit on wind and solar by 2025. So that's like 3 or 4 years away. We had that anyway. I've been on the board for well over a year now. And that was the target before this. Now there's an interim 2030 target of something like 90% renewable by 2030, right? That's annual average of the grid, not like, no limit on wind and solar means like that's instantaneous when it's available. A 90% electricity system is totally different. And that's the 2030 target now for the UK. So, and that's an island, right? With very little hydro, which means it's even harder than some of the other markets. And, in those meetings, we are looking at regional frequency control and storage and new ancillary services products and 3G and edge computing and telecoms and like a whole bunch of OEM issues. So I feel like we are trying to solve these problems today, and they will get solved, right? With digital, with hybrid plants, with storage, with what we're doing with AI and system operations, it'll get solved. We just have to work through it. So I think it's a bottleneck, this changing of the electricity system to take a larger share of variable so that we can have multiple markets that can hit 80-90% penetrations and be an annual average of 40-50%, even markets with not as much interconnection and not as much hydropower, right? Variable, that kind of variable penetration. So I think that's really, really important. And then I think the other bottlenecks we've heard are around the permitting, both interconnection and environmental permitting. We have to be smart and responsible about environmental permitting, but yes, we could move a lot faster. And then we heard about the supply chain bottlenecks that we've hit, but that those will be overcome with the capacity coming on stream. So I think a lot of work, but I don't see anything insurmountable.
Okay, thank you for that. And Alfred, I think Amarenco is one of the leading independent renewable energy producers in Europe, and you are personally more familiar with the development and investment in Austria and Central Europe, maybe also Eastern Europe. What is your assessment of solar in this region, and what's next for Amarenco's strategy?
Before I go to going to answer your question, I would just address one of the basic theme of this discussion, was the question whether 1 terawatt is it possible 1 terawatt of solar in Europe, and actually the question is not is it possible, the question is how and when to make it happen. That is most important. And as a matter of fact, the real issue is not the 1 terawatt peak capacity, but some 1,500, 2,000 terawatt hours of production and the provision of energy in line with demand. I think Melissa had already many points on many good points and important points on these topics. So for Europe, there is an absolutely a need and a must to do something, and that if you look back 1 year, the whole picture has changed. If 1 year ago it was all about making a significant contribution to the greening of the energy supply. Now we have a totally different subject now on top, and that is the independence of supply, the reduction of the energy purchase from Russia, especially gas, and that there's the whole of Europe has this issue: high energy prices, dependence on Russian gas, and that is not a problem which will go away with a peace treaty. We all hope that there will be a peace treaty very soon, but this threat and this threat that we will be cut off again from, or potentially cut off again from the gas supply, that will remain for years, maybe even for decades, or maybe even for good. So there is an absolute need that we invest now and that we achieve this 1 terawatt peak on more importantly, the 2,000 terawatt hours of solar power as soon as possible. Now, when you, and I'll come back to the what's needed for that and what is important in this context, and I'm also referring to some points Melissa has already raised. But to your question about what's next for Amarenco and what's next, what's important, what we're doing here in the region. Again, I come back here in the region, Austria, neighboring countries to the east, southeast. We are suffering from the high energy prices more than other countries. We also definitely suffering suffering more from the independence from the Russian gas supply. If, as an example, Austria depends 80% on Russian gas. I mean, this is not just there's part of it is used for power generation, for peaking power, for balancing power, for grid stabilization. That is an issue per se, but even more an issue is the fact that Austrian's industry, and we have strong industry in steel, aluminum, pulp and paper, etc. They are big gas users. So it's not just the electric energy and not just the production of solar electricity. It's also about gas and power to gas issues, which requires even more solar. And I'll come to that. So we for us, it's the right time to move on. We have to push harder, and we need to do the right things. the right things actually is not just to be, we are a pure solar developer. We are pure solar developer, but we need also to look to the left and the right. What we need is hybrid power solutions. We need a smoother generation profile, which better meets the demand, and that so it is very important to work in parallel on strategies with wind power producers, because if you know the profile of wind power generation and you add the profile of solar power generation, you will find that you get a more even, smoother generation profile, which is the first most important point. The second important point, of course, are a reinforcement of transmission lines, because we need to move power from the areas where there is sun to powers where there's no sun, where wind to where the areas where there's wind, there is no wind. So we need reinforcement of transmission lines. We need short-term and medium-term storage to balance lacks of supply, or the times where we cannot meet demand by renewable powers. And we need long-term seasonal storage. Don't forget that in Central Europe, Northern Europe, especially in those areas, that the difference between the solar production in summer and winter is huge. The more you need to go to the equator, the less you have this problem. But we do have, so we have this long-term seasonal storage issue, and today's only solution is hydrogen. So we need to build on the hydrogen. Build hydrogen policies, subsidies. We need to build hydrogen production capacities and storage capacities. And so it's not about solar power alone. It needs a holistic approach to resolve the big issues we have ahead. Although we are focusing on solar power, we're looking to the left and to right, to wind, to storage, to hydrogen production, and only if we do that, we do the right things.
Okay, thank you. Then I see the demand in this region is very urgent, and you mentioned many steps we have to do, but I assume in this situation, we may have problems with the allocation of resource. Do we have a gap between demand growth and the supply? Since I think the human resource, the investment and supply chain may all cause some impact. How should they be overcome?
I'm thinking definitely we have an issue there. We already see it today. And I'm talking from a utility size project perspective, but it is very much seen and very apparent in the small residential area and also in the commercial area. We do the supply chain issues that I think over the next 1-2 years, those things will become less of an issue. At the same time, I'm sure that Europe is going to build capacities, manufacturing capacities again here. There are initiatives, there are already first investments. So I think the supply chain issue is a short to medium term thing, but we will overcome. The human resources issue is a big issue. I think what we really need is to invest in training of the people, and that's not something which you can manage in the short term. So you need programs, big programs, to educate and train people on all different levels in the value added chain. And I think Austria does a decent job, but it's still not good enough. In other parts of Europe, I think there is more need for working on those issues.
Okay, thank you for sharing. And to our dear Federico, thank you for waiting so long time. And based on your many years of investment experience in Europe, particularly Southern Europe, like France, Italy, Greece, Spain, you mentioned, I think these areas have the best resource of light and the sun in Europe. So they are theoretically the places that benefits most from the EU 1 terawatt target, but where it work where in the implementation phase. Because, for example, I know in Italy, there are normally very long policy procedure, or Spain, they have some great constructs. So how they are actually going now?
Well, good morning, everyone, again. I think the situation is at the same time simple and complex in this respect. I think that if you need to look at a country where you will see we have seen the biggest growth in terms of solar installation, definitely Spain is paving the way, followed probably by Portugal. Italy is still on the slow part in the sense that, as you were mentioning before, the complication of the policies in Italy and the NIMBY effect that we are facing at this point in time, because there is a little bit of, let's say, a pushback from local authorities against installing in agricultural land, is probably one of the issues that Italy is facing more than other countries. Then, if you look at some others, for example, the Greece of this world, France and Germany, you clearly see the difference there. So on one side, Greece is facing more or less the same constraints of Italy, smaller projects and very distributed, so the market very fragmented. You will see Germany that's leading the way, and obviously the installation keep on coming, but it's much more a German investor market than much more an international investor market, because the cost of capital is so low, and therefore even the returns on these investments are lower than in other countries. France is a similar story in the sense that France is much more wind oriented than solar oriented, despite the fact that there are some solar installation in France. But once again, it's very much of a French market in terms of investors. They have big funds and big insurance companies and pension funds that actually invest on the equity and have the French bank financing those assets with very aggressive leverages, therefore limiting also in the risk return profile the entrance of newcomers at that cost of capital. So if I need to put my money on the countries in which it would be easier for a financial investor to enter in the years to come, definitely Portugal, Spain, and Italy are simpler in this respect, and they also offer a little bit of higher returns. Probably in the return spectrum, Italy positions itself in a little bit of the let's say higher part of the bracket, and the reason is that if you need to invest in Italy, you need to know the country very well, and therefore also trying to understand how the country, let's say, behaves, and the local, let's say, issues that you can find, which are a bit more complex than if you're investing in Spain and Portugal. But I definitely would see these three countries for somebody that is coming and bringing new capital to be the simplest and the one I'll put my money on.
Okay, then I'm wondering that would you like to briefly share with us the situation of your ongoing projects, like their types, their progress, and whether you can benefit from them?
Sorry, Charlie, I didn't catch the question. Apologies. Can you please repeat?
Okay. I want to know, would you like to briefly share with us some situation of your ongoing projects, where you just mentioned here as the macro views of the country, but what you are doing now?
Well, we're doing a series of things across Europe, and definitely what we're seeing is that we pioneered or almost now 4 years ago, unsubsidized solar in Spain, and we wanted to roll out this experience across other countries. But for example, Spain and Portugal have a much more developed PPA market, which is clearly an advantage in, let's say, unsubsidized solar installation, because investors would like to see contracted revenues for the longest period of time possible. I personally, but this is my view, and it's not probably Foresight's view, I would like not to have the PPAs and have the possibility to, in a way, indoctrinate or convince the investors that probably going fully merchant has got its own advantages, and maybe a strategy with long and short terms agreements could be a better way to actually extract value from these assets. But some of the institutional investors are very difficult to convince in that respect, and not only the institutional investors that put the equity, but also the banks that put the debt on this project. So if you don't lock in for at least 10 years your revenues, the banks won't be financing your projects. Not that in a way, debt financing in the unsubsidized world makes a big difference. So in terms of value enhancement, in terms of IRR, you get 1 to 2 points of IRR. So somebody might also argue that putting debt on these projects increases the risk of the project themselves, because obviously the volatility of the market and the creditworthiness of your PPA counterparty will play a particular role, especially in a situation in which, for example, the prices go close to zero, which was the situations in which we had during COVID, that we have seen, for example, in Italy, a couple of PPA providers that actually defaulted on their PPA agreement. Italy, I think, will follow in terms of the PPAs. The players that offer those type of agreements are more or less the same. We see now, for example, the first 5 years projects, the 5-year PPAs in Italy, which we didn't see even let's say 18 months ago. But what is lacking in Italy, for example, as opposed to Spain, is the project themselves. So there's little ready to build projects at this point in time, and the combination of the scarcity of the project with the entrance into the market of the large players, such as oil companies and utilities, as Pietro was actually pointing before, you will see that even in bidding for capacity, they bid negative prices, and that puts obviously the financial investors in a difficult position to compete in a market where the utility can be vertically integrated while the financial investor cannot, and is horizontally integrated, which is the difference between the two businesses. What you can do in order for you to enhance your returns is to enter early the value chain and therefore invest or co-invest into development in order to create your captive pipeline, and therefore manage as much as you can the economies of scales of a ever competitive market by obviously pre-booking capacity in terms of the supply of the components of these assets, negotiate and renegotiate the larger you get in terms of a portfolio, all those fixed costs that you might have, from O&M to insurance to let's say small maintenance on the field, which is washing of the panels, grass cutting and so on. So those are the things that you can do in order for you to deliver better returns to your investors. But I've been working in this market for now, since 2007, so it's 15 years. It's an ever challenging market. Every day there's a new challenge. Every day, every time that you think, okay, we now found the new solution, to make this market flourish, and it looks like a snap of fingers, and we're going to install another, 10, 15, 20 gigawatts in the next 18 months, something else happens. So I think it's kind of the curse of the solar, let's say, players of having always new challenges, a bottleneck that they have to face.
And which European country are the most promising markets in the coming 10 years, in your point of view?
In terms of installed capacity, potentially installed capacity, I think Germany will keep on growing at a different pace compared to the other. But I think that in terms of growth from where it is, I think Pietro was mentioning it before. I think Spain has got the most potential. Also simplifying the licensing system. Probably the bottleneck that Spain has is the grid. But I think investment in that respect will be undertaken and either reverse into the end user, in which obviously the building of the new substations and the interconnection with the not present will be part of that. In terms of new coming countries where it's going to be difficult still to invest from a typical institutional investor point of view, are all the new, let's say, countries that are not yet part of the euro, but they are part of the European Union. So we're going to see, for example, in the Balkans, we're going to see in Greece, we're going to see some other countries that will actually come into this market. But while it would be very viable for an industrial investor that is present there or partners up with a utility locally to keep on growing the portfolio, would be more difficult for the financial investors that actually like only super stable countries, super stable situation. And here is kind of the trade-off in those respects, because obviously financial investors would like to have very low risk and the highest return possible. So that's kind of the challenge that we face on a daily basis to try to convince them to do something more innovative.
Yeah, thank you. And next hour is our Eastern Egg round. If you have one question for your today's panel colleagues, what would the question be?
I lost you
Well,
guys.
I think Pietro would also want to join. Federico is
Frozen.
okay. Please, Pietro or Vlasios, you can all turn on your camera and voice now and join us the Eastern Egg round. Well, let's start with Melissa. If you have one questions, any panel colleagues you can pick and just ask him. Oh, Melissa, you're muted.
Sure. As I was listening to all of the different presentations by my colleagues, there is one question that I'm very, very curious about. So, you know, one of the things that we really like about solar, right, is that it's super configurable, and we're seeing so many different combinations of higher DC-AC ratios and bifacial and tracking at all different sizes to make that solar business case work. We're seeing, you know, solar being able to provide reactive power, frequency response, lots of different uses. So great on the solar side. We see these opportunities even bigger when you combine them with wind or with storage or with buildings and retrofit. So like taking that configurability and the really awesomeness that's already there, but then you can combine it, as we've heard, with wind and with batteries and with buildings and all the other, even make that configurability like squared. The regulation and the policies that would encourage that. So my question to the panel is, are you seeing, like, could we move faster, or what do you recommend in terms of any kind of policies that would support this hybridization and really optimizing solar plus with all the different pieces in the way that, like, solar in its own house, it can do it, right? But then when it's solar with everything else, it really, we see a lot of operational opportunities. And I'm curious to all of you, because I'm not as close to the policy side, how easy is it in terms of the permitting and the incentives to be able to, like, really scale this in the next few years to take advantage of those hybrid opportunities?
If you want, I could have a go. Yeah, it's the first one. Yeah, it's a very, actually, that's always the point of the question, that you can rephrase it like in if the policies that we do have already are substantial enough, and if we do have cumulative experience on them to grow them further. I would say that what we have seen so far in this world on this type of policy levels is that the policies have evolved over the course of time. We're not back in the 80s or 90s where we had just, you know, the feed-in tariffs, and things have developed now much more elaborate, and the policies are a bit better targeted. For what we should consider is that mainly the numbers and the targets that we have to achieve are so high now. We don't speak about, you know, just 1%, 2%, 3%, but really about much higher targets and much higher capacity to be built. So the policy should really target more at the financing and the upfront financing of the whole part. That's what I see as being the biggest danger. And why I say that, because the alternative policy, the alternative funding that member states do give is for fossil fuel infrastructure. And especially now after Ukraine, we see that it's a risk that we go to, you know, we're going to build more terminals for LNG and so forth and so forth. So, and we see that a lot of the plans, also from the RRFs, which are supposed to go on climate, and also from the other types of plans, and that would go normally for climate and energy and all that, might in the end stay to finance bills for consumers due to the high gas prices. And the second one is that they end up financing on an equal terms fossil fuel projects. So I would say that the risk for me is that the policies that are in place in the NECPs and the revised NECPs of the member states' national energy climate plans I refer to should have a very clear targeting, very clear assigning of funds on how much exactly these funds will be attributed to solar. This could make a much clearer, I would say, signal for the investors just to see, okay, how much each country is willing to give out for our projects in its part. I'm going away from the permitting and all that part. I mean, permitting indeed it's an issue, but there are better and better regulation for that. And also there is fast track procedures in several of the countries you mentioned already. But to me, the most important is that to avoid the insecurity that now that member states might have to opt in for financing bills, assigning large parts of the budget to financing bills and fossil gas infrastructure, rather than bringing them to the solar part. Okay, to me, this would be the highest skepticism on how some countries would end up, because even the countries you mentioned, take into account where I'm from, Greece, for example, is that you see that Greece is moving on to a large, although they speak a lot about the RS, in the end of the day, now they're going for a massive exploration, fossil gas exploration phases in the seaside. Also, they are moving on towards massively on LNG and CNG. So you don't know, from an investor perspective, I would need a clearer signal. Is this country finally going on for higher subsidy rates or for strong subsidy rates and for long-term and stable subsidy rates for solar or not? So such questions would come up to me. Do you need security and stability for the next 8 at least years due to the high targets of the 8 years to come?
Okay, thank you, Vlasios and Pietro. I've already seen your questions in the chat box. Who you want to ask and what's your question?
Yeah, I would ask it to who's currently active in
Pietro, your voice is very
Sorry,
low.
can you hear me better? I would ask it to who is currently active with projects in the permitting phase. So if you have any visibility, could you share, whether, at least we're hearing that this is happening, but I don't have enough perhaps data points supporting this, but we do hear that in Germany, local communities are opening up. Communities which were previously against solar in their backyard are now opening up to building a projects in their backyard as a result of the ongoing war in Ukraine. So it would be great if you could confirm that. Do you see the same trend in your markets or with your projects? And then my second one was around bottlenecks and whether you see any bottleneck aside from the permitting, whether you see a shortage of electricians, and how, if that is happening, how is that affecting your projects?
You can just direct pick the lucky guy to answer your question.
I don't know, maybe Alfred or Federico.
Yeah, I'm happy to give you an answer. I'm not currently not involved in the German business, but the Central Europe or Austrian business in the development phase. There is the acceptance for renewable power is now the acceptance for renewable power is increasing very much. And as I said before, it was in the past, a year ago, it was more about the greening of the energy supplies. It's now about plannable and lower energy costs, stability, long-term. It's the independence of supply. It's about regional added value. It is, and then which we have touched a little bit, it's also about a increasing role or increasing potential for regional energy communities, local and regional energy communities. People now really talk a lot and listen to these opportunities to produce their own energy. There's not we all know that this is not about being completely self-supplying. It is about just not using the grid, generating their own value in the region, adding additional jobs in managing those systems, in maintaining those systems. So there is now, and that is most important. There's now we see this change, that the acceptance by the people, the acceptance by the communities and by the decision makers when it comes to permitting, that is increasing now, and I expect that will continue to increase as we go into the future of this uncertainty in Ukraine, in uncertainty with the relationship between the Western and the Russian world, which is a push for us. It's not good. I mean, nobody wants it. Nobody wanted it, and nobody likes it. But it is a push for the transformation change, the change we need anyway.
Thank you. Federico, did you want to add
Yeah,
on
well,
that, perhaps?
if you want my perspective, I think it's different from in different countries. So if you talk about Italy, no, I haven't seen a change in mindset because of the war in Ukraine. But that's a typicality of Italy, where saying no, it's a way of exercising power, and therefore vetoes are there not because they're actually rational. It's because somebody in power exercises power by putting the veto, and then people gather in front of him to convince him of the opposite. I think that Spain is it's a good example of the fact that the country is giving a big push by creating this new map and simplifying the environmental impact assessment of these plants. Why, for example, in Italy, we haven't seen that, despite the fact that the ministry has centralized, let's say, the environmental impact assessment of certain projects that are beyond the 10 megawatt size for solar, and I think it's 25 for wind. I don't remember the exact number, but there's a push in that respect. But locally, I do still see the opposition in Italy. I'm not sure what the opposition is in Spain, also because in Spain you had the advantage that the amount of land that is deserted that you can use, and where some of these projects have been licensed, is such that clearly there's the lesser bottleneck. In Italy, the space is less. The local communities are stronger. The tourism, it's key, and therefore there's always an argument to say, well, actually, no, we don't want it. So that's the kind of dynamic that I'm seeing there. And no, I haven't seen a shortage of electricians.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Federico, and thank you. Well, then it's my questions to, or if you were to make a specific numerical estimation, what outcome do you think that European could reach in 2030? Melissa?
I get to start. So I don't want to do a numerical number, because I think it's more around the share of variable penetration in the system. And I think that in some of the modeling that we did, we're very optimistic in 2030 that 55% of the electricity system could be wind and solar. So that's variable, which means you would hit north of 80% instantaneous penetration in most of the EU 27 countries, right, at that level. So that's actually a pretty significant level, given the seasonality that we just heard about. Like, it is pretty huge, even, you know, winter, summer, and within weeks, even a January, February. So that's a big number, the 55%. That is higher than the Fit for 55, probably wind and solar share. And then the solar share of that, we think could be 20-25%, could be half, right? So that's a pretty big share, because I am optimistic that we have energy efficiency and demand optimization, Vlasios. So I don't want to put a number in, because I don't want to encourage a big number. I don't want to say 3,600 terawatt hours, because I do believe that we can knock 20% off that easily if we can get into this demand optimization, energy efficiency, building a lot of these things out in our kind of retrofit cycle, right? So I don't want to put a high number there, just because it's more about the share of solar than an absolute number for solar.
Okay, thank you. Vlasios, could you please give us a range or a specific number about this?
And let's see if the impact assessment now will be carried out, and the assessment will be carried out by the Commission on the 420 gigawatt extra capacity of solar would work out or not, if we go for the 40% target. I fully agree with Melissa, what she said on this point, that indeed we tend to speak about the capacity part, but we have to consider it always on the final energy consumption, how far it goes, and if the whole thing will be needed and to what extent. Because indeed, if we have higher energy efficiency rates, we might need in the end up reduce the whole consumption part and reduce the whole requirements. So if I would speak again purely from a policy perspective, if we stick to the 40%, what the target could be although 40 is a small amount from what I heard now from Elisa's projections. I mean, they aim for much higher. But if we go for the low end, it would mean for 120. And the question is, do we have enough funds for that? That's my question to all, and as you see it in your countries, if you believe that the fund is enough for that and the way that funds are allocated. Okay, this is a question going back and forth, in a ping pong to the other parts.
Yeah, thank you for that. And in the end, as our audience question session, I have selected one question in advance, and is it possible to achieve made in Europe for photovoltaics? Well, we know that a lot of PV related equipment is, they are currently imported. So what role will internally produced equipments play in the future? Well, Federico?
I do believe there's going to be some production in Europe of this equipment, but I don't think in the short term we're going to manage to overcome the dependency from China, because the rate at which they can produce, it would require years if we start today, and I would say about 5 to 10 in order for us to reach a meaningful capacity. Compared to what is already being produced there. And then obviously labor costs in Europe and location costs where you can install those factories is definitely higher than in China. So we might want to start producing here, but then it would be a what cost, and therefore what it would be the impact on the LCOE. That would be my take. But what we should do in terms of policies, I'm sorry, I go back to one of the questions that was made before. I think from an investor point of view, I think that the policies for pension funds, insurance companies and banks is on one hand to reduce let's say regulatory capital for those investments that are made in renewables, make it mandatory for a certain amount of investors to actually dedicate capital at the lowest cost possible, but is actually very similar to whatever, I don't know, government bonds can be trading at in order for those funds to be catalyzed into renewable energy. So those should be the two keys, other than obviously also the subsidies or the control for differences. If we dedicate the capital to some of those players that actually don't do it because they're not forced to do it, then I think we're going to get a better response in that respect. We can fund those projects easily. We can, let's say, reduce the dependence from banks in terms of providing the debt, and we can do this on a full equity basis. And I think the whole market would benefit from that.
So is there anyone have different opinions? Well, then I think let's end here. Thanks for the informative and thought-provoking discussion. Our event is coming to an end here, and I believe through this webinar, we all have gained new insights of the solar market in Europe. And once again, I want to thank you for your participation, support, and see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.